The apartment across the hall wasn't empty. Used to think the worst part about living alone was the silence. I was wrong. The worst part is hearing something inside that silence, and realizing it knows you're listening. This happened 3 years ago, when I moved into a small apartment building outside Portland, Oregon. I was 26 at the time, and had just started working for a software company downtown. The job paid well enough, but rent in the city was ridiculous. So, I chose a cheaper place about 40 minutes away. The building was called Cedar View Apartments. There were no cedar trees, and there wasn't much of a view. It was an old 3-story building squeezed between a laundromat and an abandoned medical office. The carpet smelled damp. The elevator shook whenever it moved, and most of the hallway lights made a faint buzzing sound. Still, my apartment was clean, the neighborhood seemed quiet, and the rent was almost $300 cheaper than anything else I had found. I lived in apartment 314. At the very end of the third-floor hallway, directly across from me was apartment 315. It was empty when I moved in. At least, that's what the property manager told me. Her name was Linda. She was a woman in her 50s with short gray hair and a habit of speaking too quickly. While she showed me around, I asked how long the apartment across from mine had been vacant. She looked at the door for a moment before answering. About 6 months. I asked if someone had died there. I meant it as a joke. Linda didn't laugh. She just said, "The previous tenant left unexpectedly." Then she changed the subject. I didn't think much about it at the time. For the first few weeks, everything was normal. I left for work at around 7 every morning and came home after 6. I rarely saw my neighbors. Most of the people on my floor were older and kept to themselves. The man in 310 walked a small white dog. A woman named Rachel lived in 308 with her teenage son, and an elderly man named Mr. Harris lived near the elevator. Nobody lived in 315. The door was always closed, and there was never any light beneath it. Then, one Tuesday night, I heard someone moving inside. It was just after midnight. I was lying in bed, watching videos on my phone, when I heard a dull scraping sound through my front wall. It sounded like a chair being dragged across the floor. I paused the video. The sound stopped. A few seconds later, it started again. Scrape. Pause. Scraped up because apartment 315 was directly across the hallway. It didn't share a wall with mine. That meant the sound had to be loud enough to travel through the apartment door and across the hall. I got out of bed and walked into my living room. The scraping continued. I approached my front door and looked through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The door to 315 was closed. But there was now a thin line of yellow light beneath it. I stared at it for several seconds. Someone had moved in. That was the obvious explanation. Maybe Linda had rented the place and forgotten to mention it. I went back to bed. The next morning, the light was gone. There were no boxes outside the apartment, no welcome mat, no trash bags. Nothing that suggested someone had recently moved in. As I was leaving, I ran into Linda near the elevator. I asked if she had rented apartment 315. Her expression changed immediately. No. I told her I had heard someone inside during the night. She gave a nervous smile. Probably the pipes. Old buildings make strange noises. There was a light under the door. Linda looked toward the end of the hallway. Then she said, "Maintenance may have left it on." I knew she was lying. Not because of what she said, but because she refused to look at me when she said it. That evening, when I returned from work, I noticed a small piece of paper taped to my door. It was blank. No writing. No symbol. Just a square piece of white printer paper held up with clear tape. I pulled it down and threw it away. I assumed some kid had done it. That night, at exactly 12:17, the scraping began again. This time it was followed by footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps moving around inside apartment 315. I stood behind my door and listened. The footsteps stopped. Then someone knocked. 3 soft knocks. I froze. I waited for them to knock again. Nothing happened. I looked through the peephole. No one was there. But the door to 315 was open. Only a few inches. Inside was complete darkness. I considered calling Linda, but it was after midnight, and I didn't want to sound paranoid. Instead, I locked the deadbolt and returned to my bedroom. I left the television on to cover the noise. At some point, I fell asleep. The following morning, I found another blank piece of paper taped to my door. This one was larger. And it wasn't completely blank. Near the bottom corner was a faint gray mark. It looked like the partial print of a dirty thumb. I took a photo and sent it to Linda. She responded almost an hour later. I'll ask maintenance to check the hallway. That was all she said. When I came home, the door to 315 had been sealed with a small strip of blue security tape. I felt relieved. If someone opened the door, the tape would tear. That night, I stayed awake until after 1. No scraping. No footsteps. No knocking. The hallway remained silent. The next morning, the blue tape was still intact. I started to think I had overreacted. Maybe the noises really had been pipes. Maybe the door had been left open by maintenance. Maybe the paper was some stupid joke. For the next 4 nights, nothing happened. Then, on Sunday morning, I woke up to the sound of my front doorknob turning. Not rattling. Turning. Slowly. Someone outside was testing it. I sat up in bed and held my breath. The knob turned again, then stopped. I grabbed my phone and walked quietly into the living room. Through the peephole, I could see the back of a person standing directly outside my door. It appeared to be a man. He was tall and thin, wearing a gray hooded sweatshirt. His face was turned toward apartment 315. He stood completely still. I called the police. While I whispered my address to the dispatcher, the man moved toward the apartment across the hall. The blue security tape was still attached to the door and frame. He didn't tear it. He simply placed one hand against the door. Then he pushed. The door opened inward. The tape remained perfectly intact. For a moment, my mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It was as though the tape had been placed over an already open door. The man stepped inside. The door slowly closed behind him. The police arrived about 7 minutes later. 2 officers searched the 3rd floor, then entered apartment 315 with Linda's master key. Nobody was inside. The apartment was completely empty. No furniture. No clothes. No sign that anyone had been staying there. One of the officers told me the back window was locked from the inside. There was no other exit. I showed them the photo of the man through my peephole, but because of the angle, it only showed part of his hood and shoulder. The security tape was still unbroken. Linda removed it while the officers were there. I asked her again about the previous tenant. This time, she told me more. His name had been Daniel Price. He was 32 and lived alone. 6 months earlier, he had stopped paying rent. When Linda entered the apartment, all of his belongings were still there. His wallet, his phone, his car keys, his clothes. But Daniel was gone. The police listed him as a missing person. They never found him. Afterward, his family removed his belongings, and the apartment remained vacant. I asked Linda why she hadn't rented it again. She said several people had viewed the apartment, but nobody wanted it. When I asked why, she hesitated. Then she said, they all said it smelled strange. That night, I stayed at a friend's house. I told him everything. He laughed at first, but when I showed him the photos, he became quiet. I considered breaking my lease. The problem was that I had spent most of my savings moving in. I couldn't afford another deposit, moving fees, and higher rent. So I decided to stay. I bought a small security camera and placed it above my front door, facing the hallway. I also bought a door alarm and one of those metal bars that brace beneath the doorknob. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. The camera recorded neighbors walking past, delivery drivers, and maintenance workers. Apartment 315 remained closed. Then, one Thursday, I received an alert while I was at work. Motion detected at front door. I opened the live camera feed. The hallway was empty. Then the door to apartment 315 slowly opened. A man stepped out, the same gray hoodie, the same tall, narrow frame. He moved across the hallway and stood in front of my door. His head was lowered. I watched from my desk as he raised one hand and placed another blank piece of paper against my door. He used a strip of clear tape to attach it. Then he looked directly at the camera. I finally saw his face. It was Daniel Price. I recognized him from a missing person photo Linda had shown the police. But something was wrong. His eyes were open far too wide. His skin was gray. And he was smiling, not a normal smile. His lips were stretched, so tightly that I could see nearly all of his teeth. He stared into the camera for almost 30 seconds. Then he walked back into apartment 315. I called the police and left work immediately. By the time I arrived, 2 officers were already searching the apartment. Again, it was empty, but this time they found something. On the floor near the bedroom closet was a strip of clear tape. It looked old and dirty. One officer opened the closet. There was a square access panel in the ceiling. It led into a narrow maintenance space above the apartments. The officer climbed through. A few minutes later, he called for the other officer. They discovered someone had been living above the hallway ceiling. There were blankets, water bottles, food wrappers, candles, and dozens of printed photographs. Every photograph was of a resident in the building. People leaving their apartments. People returning home. People sleeping. There were photos taken through windows and partially open doors. Most of them were recent, but some were older than 6 months. Daniel had apparently discovered the maintenance space and used it to move between parts of the building. Without being seen, he had made small openings above several apartments. Police believe he had been watching tenants for months before his disappearance. Then an officer brought down a cardboard box. Inside were hundreds of blank sheets of white paper. Each one had a name written on the back. My name was on 37 of them. The papers that had been placed on my door appeared blank because the writing faced the door. I asked the officer what that meant. He said they didn't know, but I did. Daniel had been marking me. Counting something. The police searched the entire building. They found several hidden passages and loose ceiling panels, but they never found Daniel. That evening, I packed a suitcase and left. I stayed with my friend until I found another apartment. A month later, Cedar View was temporarily closed while the owners repaired the ceilings and replaced the locks. Linda quit soon afterward. I tried to forget the whole thing. Then, almost a year later, I received an envelope in the mail. There was no return address. Inside was a single piece of white paper. At first, it looked blank. Then I remembered. I turned it over. On the back, someone had written 38. I called the police. They took the letter but found no fingerprints and no usable DNA. I moved again. I changed jobs. I removed my name from every public address database I could find. For almost 2 years, I heard nothing. Then last month, I woke up at 12:17 in the morning. Someone was knocking on my apartment door. 3 soft knocks. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, a piece of paper slid slowly beneath the door. I waited until morning before touching it. The front was blank. On the back was a number, 39, and below it, in smaller handwriting, were 4 words. I found you again.